Hey everyone, welcome back to Inside Vietnam. If you've spent any time on this channel, you know the shape of most of the stories we tell here. Guy arrives. Guy falls hard, fast, money starts moving. Warning signs get ignored. And somewhere down the line, usually sooner than later, reality arrives and it isn't gentle. Today's story doesn't follow that shape. Today's story is about a man who did everything right. Everything the forums tell you to do, everything the cautionary videos warn you about, everything the experienced expats say you need to know before you book that flight, he'd absorbed all of it. 3 years of research. Spreadsheets. Reddit threads. He watched videos on this exact channel and took notes. His name is Lorne. He's 54. He's from Calgary, Alberta. And for 22 years, he worked IT support for an oil and gas company. Steady guy. Careful guy. The kind of man who checks twice and decides once. And I want you to hold that image in your head because what happened to Lorne over the next 5 years in Vietnam is one of the most quietly devastating stories we've ever had on this channel. Not because it happened fast, but precisely because it didn't. This one's going to stick with you. Here's his story, in his own words. Okay, so, where do I even start with this? I guess I start the same place everything starts, which is with the version of yourself you had before the decision, before the flight, before all of it. My name's Lorne. I'm 54 years old. I spent 22 years doing IT support for an oil and gas firm in Calgary, which, if you know Calgary, you already have a pretty good picture of what that life looks like. Big glass towers downtown, badge in at 8, badge out whenever the tickets stop coming in. I was help desk, then senior help desk, then some title they gave me that meant senior help desk with slightly better parking. I was good at it. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't coasting. I was the guy people called when something actually mattered. When the VP's laptop died 20 minutes before a board presentation. When the server room decided to have a moment. I fixed things. That was the job. Show up, identify the problem, resolve it, document it, move on. I owned my condo outright by the time I was 46. No mortgage, no debt. Good pension coming at 55. Around $127,000 in savings. On paper, I had done everything correctly. On paper, Lorne was fine. And he was, mostly. I mean that. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I was secretly miserable the whole time, because that's not true, and it would make for a better story than I actually have. The truth is, I was just quiet. My life was quiet. Organized. Predictable in a way that felt earned rather than boring. At least for a long time. The marriage thing, right. I get asked about this, and I never quite know how to answer it. It's not like I made a decision not to get married. I didn't decide anything. In my 30s, I was building something: the condo, the savings, the career track, and I told myself there was time for the other stuff once the foundation was solid. In my 40s, I stopped having that conversation with myself, not consciously. I just noticed one day that I'd stopped having it, like a window you forget to open, until one morning you realize the room's been a bit airless for a while, and you can't remember exactly when that started. I dated. Occasionally not nothing, that got very far. I was comfortable with my own company, which sounds like a good quality, until you realize it also means you can go a very long time without noticing what you're missing. The Sunday morning that I keep coming back to, the one that I think was actually the start of all this, happened in November 2015. I was 51. I was sitting in a Tim Hortons at 7 in the morning with a large double-double and nowhere to be. And the place was full of people, families, guys my age with their wives. A couple young mothers with strollers. Everyone had somewhere to go or someone to be with. And I just sat there with my coffee and I thought, that's about as dramatic as it got. Just The silence had a texture to it, is how I'd describe it. Not pain exactly. Not loneliness in the crying into your pillow sense. More like the feeling you get when you arrive somewhere and check the address twice and then realize you've been on the wrong bus the whole time. Not a crisis. Just a quiet, clear understanding that the trajectory you're on ends somewhere you didn't actually choose. I went home, and I don't know why, but I typed "retire early Southeast Asia" into Google. And that was that. Now here's where I need you to understand something about who I am, because it matters for everything that comes after. I don't browse. When I get interested in something, I research it the way I used to diagnose server problems, systematically, thoroughly, with documentation. I built a spreadsheet comparing cost of living across 12 cities. Da Nang, Chiang Mai, Penang, Bali, Medellin, Lisbon, 12 cities, 40-plus variables, color-coded by category. I cross-referenced expat forums, Reddit threads, Facebook groups. I read every cautionary tale I could find. I watched YouTube channels, including, yes, this one. I have the watch history. I sat in my condo in Calgary on a Tuesday evening, eating leftover pho, the kind from a container, not the real stuff. I didn't know yet what the real stuff tasted like, and I watched video after video about men who'd gone to Southeast Asia and gotten taken apart. And I took notes. Actual notes. In a document I titled, I Kid You Not, Red Flags and Risk Factors. I told myself I was inoculated. I told myself I knew the patterns. Vietnam specifically appealed to me because it felt, and I actually wrote this in an expat forum post that I still have saved somewhere. It felt more serious than the alternatives, less written off, more culturally substantial. Thailand felt like a place people went to stop thinking. Vietnam felt like a place you might actually build something. I have the post saved. I've read it back a few times since. I'll let you draw your own conclusions about the man who wrote it. I booked the flight in December 2018, one way to Da Nang, trial year. If it didn't work, I'd come home. Simple as that. I was 52 years old. I had $127,000 in savings, a pension coming in 3 years, and a document called Red Flags and Risk Factors on my laptop. I was ready. I had absolutely no idea what was coming. I landed in Da Nang on a Tuesday in early February 2019, and the first thing that hit me when I walked out of the terminal was the air. I know that sounds like nothing. Air is air. But I had just come from Calgary in February, which means I'd come from minus 18 degrees and a sky the color of old concrete. And when those automatic doors opened and that warm, thick, faintly sweet air came at me, I just stood there for a moment like an idiot with my carry-on bag and my backpack and my very thorough printed checklist. And I thought, okay, this might actually work. That's the most emotional I'm going to admit to being at the airport. I had a room booked in a serviced apartment in An Hai Bach, which is a residential neighborhood on the east side of the Han River. Not the tourist strip, not the beachfront. I'd specifically chosen it because it was where people actually lived. Local markets, local restaurants, motorbikes going somewhere with purpose rather than circling the block for fun. I'd read enough forum posts to know that men who plant themselves in tourist zones spend their first month eating overpriced Western food and wondering why everything feels fake. I wasn't going to do that. The apartment was fine. Clean, simple, a balcony with a plastic chair on it, a view of a narrow street with a noodle vendor who set up at 6 every morning. I paid about 5 million dong a month, roughly 220 Canadian dollars at the time, after a Calgary mortgage, or I suppose in my case a Calgary condo fee and maintenance on a building I already owned. This felt almost comically cheap. I wrote it down in my spreadsheet. Accommodation, under budget, first entry. I gave myself the first week just to exist, walk the neighborhood, find the coffee, figure out the traffic. The traffic needs its own paragraph. I had read about the traffic. I had watched videos of the traffic. I thought I understood the traffic. I did not understand the traffic. Da Nang is not the worst city in Vietnam for it. That's Ho Chi Minh, by a significant margin, as I would later discover. But the first time I tried to cross a 4-lane road with no lights and a continuous river of motorbikes coming at me from 3 directions, I stood on that curb for a solid pho. Minutes before a woman about 70 years old carrying a bag of vegetables walked past me, stepped into the flow without breaking stride, and disappeared safely to the other side. I followed in her exact footsteps like a duckling. It worked. I did this for about 2 weeks before I figured out the actual method, which is that you just move at a steady pace and let them flow around you. You don't stop, you don't speed up, you just keep moving and trust the system. It occurred to me later that this was also useful life advice that I completely failed to apply to other aspects of my time here, but that's getting ahead of things. I found the Café Suada about 4 days in. Iced coffee with sweetened condensed milk, served in a glass about a third full of ice, which you stir until everything is the same color as motor oil. You drink it sitting on a plastic stool about 8 inches off the ground at a folding table on the footpath, while motorbikes go past close enough to ruffle your hair. It is extremely good. It is also about 15,000 dong, which is less than $1. I had 2 a day for the better part of 5 years, and I have no regrets about that particular decision whatsoever. By the end of week 2, I'd found the co-working space. It was a 10-minute walk from the apartment, up a side street, second floor of a shop house with a hand-painted sign and good Wi-Fi. I'd signed up for a monthly membership, about $60, because I had a project I was working on. Home automation stuff, hobby level, but something I'd been meaning to dig into for years and never had the mental space for back home. I set up at a desk by the window, plugged in, and got to work. That was my routine for the first 6 weeks, more or less. Coffee, walk or grab bike across the city, co-working space, lunch at whatever place looked good and had plastic stools, back to the apartment. Evenings, I'd cook something simple or find a calm-tam place nearby and eat rice and pork chop and a fried egg for about 80 cents. I was sleeping well. My blood pressure was probably lower than it had been in a decade. I was not, I want to emphasize, desperately lonely. I'm good on my own. I've had a lot of practice. But I wasn't not lonely either. I just hadn't named it yet. I met Lynn at the co-working space at roughly the 6-week mark. She managed the front desk and handled member accounts, billing, access, sorting out the printer when it jammed, which was frequently. She was 34, small, practical looking in the way that people who are always actually doing something tend to look. Her English was careful and correct, like she'd learned it properly rather than picked it up. The first thing she said to me that I actually remember was not hello and not welcome. It was a comment about my coffee order. I had, apparently, developed a habit of coming in and asking if they could make me something roughly approximating a flat white. This was not on their menu. They had Vietnamese coffee and some instant stuff. And I had been doing this for about 2 weeks with varying success. On this particular morning, Lynn was at the desk instead of the usual guy, and I started to describe what I was after, and she looked at me for a moment and said, in that careful, precise English of hers, "Why is your order so complicated? We have 2 coffees." Not unkind, not flirtatious, just direct, mildly exasperated, the way someone is exasperated by a printer that keeps jamming. Like, I was a minor inefficiency she had noticed. I laughed. She didn't particularly. I had one of the 2 coffees she actually had. It was fine. Better than fine, honestly. I thought about that interaction for the rest of the day, and I couldn't entirely work out why. I think it was just the shock of it. For 22 years, I had been, professionally and personally, a person who other people processed, moved through, noted, resolved, moved on from. I was reliable. I was useful. I was not someone people looked at with even mild exasperation, because that would have required noticing me specifically first. She'd noticed me specifically. Even if just to tell me my coffee order was unreasonable. Looking back now, I can see exactly what happened in that moment, and why it hit me the way it did. A man who spent decades being furniture doesn't need someone to think he's wonderful. He just needs someone to see him clearly enough to have an opinion. That was it. That was the whole thing. I just didn't know it yet. So I didn't ask her out. Not right away. I want to be clear that this was a decision, not shyness. I'd read enough forum posts and watched enough videos to know that one of the most consistent patterns in these situations is speed. Guy arrives, meets someone within the first 2 weeks, is head over heels by the end of the month. That's the story you hear. And I'd cataloged that pattern specifically in my red flags document under the heading, Attachment Timeline. Fast attachment equals flag. That was the rule. So I waited. And while I waited, we just talked. It happened the way conversations happen at a place you go to every day. She'd be at the desk when I came in, I'd collect my key card or sort out some membership thing, and we'd exchange a few sentences. Nothing significant. She asked what I was working on, and I explained the home automation project, smart switches, sensors, a hub system I was trying to build from scratch. And she listened with the expression of someone who is politely processing information they don't particularly need. She told me the co-working space was having a slow season. That March was always quiet before the summer heat pushed more people indoors. Small things, nothing, that felt like it was going anywhere. But here's what I noticed. She never asked me if I was married, never asked if I had a girlfriend, never made any comment about how handsome I was or how much she liked Canadian men. I know how that sounds like a low bar, but you have to understand the context. I'd been in Da Nang for 2 months by this point, and I'd had enough interactions with people in service roles, guest house staff, tour operators, a couple of restaurant owners near the tourist strip to recognize what cultivation looks like when it's happening. There's a warmth to it, a particular kind of attention that you can feel has an aim. Lynn didn't have that. She was just present. Sometimes helpful, sometimes mildly distracted, occasionally a bit short when she was busy. A person at work, basically. I found that very reassuring. I wrote it down. Actual note. No obvious cultivation behavior. Seems indifferent to personal details. In hindsight, indifference and patience are not the same thing, and I was not equipped at that point to tell them apart. At roughly the 2-month mark, I asked if she wanted to get dinner sometime. She said, and I remember this fairly clearly, "Okay, yes. Thursday is okay." Not enthusiastic, not coy, just a scheduling confirmation. I went back to my desk and sat there for a moment, feeling something I can only describe as cautiously encouraged. We went to a place about a 5-minute walk from the co-working space. Local restaurant, plastic chairs, a menu that had pictures because they were used to foreigners wandering in. I had the bun cha grilled pork and noodles in a light broth with herbs, and she had something I didn't catch the name of that arrived in a clay pot and smelled extraordinary. We split a couple of Halida beers, which is the local Da Nang brand, and which tastes roughly like all beers taste when you're in the right mood, which I was. She asked more questions than she answered. I noticed that. She wanted to know about Calgary, about what the winters were actually like, about whether I'd ever worked anywhere other than one company. She seemed genuinely curious, rather than performing curiosity, though I acknowledge those two things can look identical from the inside. I told her about the job, about the condo, about why Vietnam rather than somewhere else. She listened. She didn't volunteer much about herself beyond basics. Family up north near Hugh, younger brother still in school, her mother not in great health. She said it straightforwardly, not to evoke anything. I paid. She didn't make a show of reaching for her bag, but she didn't expect it either, if that distinction makes sense. It just happened the way it happens when two people have an implicit understanding about who's paying without making it a thing. We did it again 2 weeks later. Then a walk along the Han River one evening, watching the Dragon Bridge with about 400 tourists doing the same thing, both of us eating banh mi from a cart and not saying much. Comfortable quiet. I hadn't had comfortable quiet with another person in a long time. About 3.5 months in, she mentioned one afternoon that her motorbike had been making a noise, and she'd finally taken it in. The repair was going to cost about 2 million dong. That's roughly $85 Canadian. She said it the way you'd mention any annoying household expense, not to me specifically. More just said it while she was sorting papers at the desk. I offered to help with it. She looked at me and said no, it was fine, she'd manage. I said I'd like to. It wasn't a big amount. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay, thank you." And that was that. No drama, no effusive gratitude, no particular weight placed on it. I transferred the money that afternoon via the banking app I'd set up. $85. Less than I'd spent on a single dinner in Calgary without thinking twice. About a month after that, we were sitting at a cafe near the river one evening. Small place, single bulb strung over the door, the sound of a television from somewhere inside, and she mentioned her brother. He'd been accepted somewhere decent for university, she said, which was good. But the enrollment fees were a problem. She said it looking into her glass, not at me. Clearly not asking, so I asked, "What did they come to?" She shook her head. Said it was a family thing. I said, "What did they come to?" She told me, about 14 million dong. Around $600. I said I could lend it to her. I used that word deliberately, lend. She said no. Then she said she would pay it back when she could. Then she took out her phone and opened the Notes app and typed something and showed it to me. It said, in careful English, "I owe you 14 million VND to Lorne." Date, her name. I photographed it. I'm telling you that detail because I need you to understand what that felt like. An IOU in a Notes app is not a legal document. It means nothing. If someone decides, it means nothing. But to me, in that moment, it meant everything. It meant she wasn't just taking. It meant she was acknowledging an obligation. It meant she was someone who kept track. That photograph felt like evidence. That's the word I keep coming back to. Evidence. I emailed my old colleague Dave in Calgary the next day. We'd worked together for 11 years, and he was the only person back home I kept in regular contact with. I told him I'd met someone. He asked the obvious question was I sure about what I was getting into? Had I read the forums? Did I know the risks? And I said yes to all of it, and then I said, "She's not what I expected to find here." He said, "That's either a good sign or a very bad one." I told him it was a good sign. I was certain of it. I had the photograph to prove it. Around month 5, something shifted in how Lynn talked to me. Not dramatically, just a degree or two warmer. We'd settled into a rhythm by then. Dinners once or twice a week, the occasional weekend afternoon walking somewhere. A habit of getting café suo together on Saturday mornings, at a place near the river where the owner knew her and brought her order without being asked. I liked those mornings. The humidity was already building by 9 o'clock, and the street outside was all motorbikes and delivery scooters, and the smell of something frying from the kitchen next door. And we'd just sit there on our low plastic stools and talk, or not talk, in roughly equal measure. It was around month 7 that she mentioned the family trip. Not as a request exactly, more as an idea she was thinking out loud. Her mother had been asking about me. She went up to Hugh every few months anyway. If I wanted to come, there was a guest house nearby that was clean and cheap, 2 days maybe. I said yes immediately, then spent about a week quietly preparing for it like it was a technical assessment. I'm not exaggerating. I went back to the forums. I read everything I could find about meeting a Vietnamese girlfriend's family. What to bring, how to behave, what the signals were, what the visit was supposed to mean, and what it actually meant. The consensus was that being introduced to family was significant. It meant you were being taken seriously. It also, I noted with my risk assessment brain fully engaged, could be a stage-setting exercise. I filed both possibilities and decided I'd observe carefully and draw conclusions from the data. We took a bus up from Da Nang, 3.5 hours north on the coastal road, the South China Sea occasionally visible out the right side window. The bus's air conditioning set to somewhere around Arctic. I had a bag with fruit, a bunch of rambutans and some mangoes, and an envelope with 500,000 dong in it, about $22, which several forum posts had agreed was an appropriate gesture without being ostentatious. I had checked this figure twice. The house was on a narrow lane on the outskirts of Hue, past the old city walls, small, tidy, a pot of something cooking that I could smell from the front gate. Lynn's mother was smaller than I expected, somewhere in her early 60s, with the particular quality of stillness that people have when they've been managing a lot for a long time. The brother Min, 20, quiet to the point of near invisibility, nodded at me and disappeared into another room. There was a meal: rice, pork braised in something that tasted like caramel and fish sauce, a plate of greens, soup. They insisted I eat more than I could. I tried. The envelope was accepted without comment, which I'd been told was correct. I stayed in the guest house 200 meters down the lane. It cost around $8 a night and had a ceiling fan that worked in 2 of its 3 settings. I didn't mind. I sat on the small balcony that evening eating a banh mi I'd bought from a cart on the walkover, and I thought about the day with the deliberateness I brought to most things. What I concluded was, it passed. The variable had been stress-tested and it had held. The mother was real. The house was real. The brother was real. There was nothing performative about any of it. No one was trying to impress me. No one had made a show of poverty. No one had angled toward money. It was just a family, having dinner. On a narrow lane in Hue, I drove back to Da Nang the following afternoon, feeling something I can only describe as settled. About 2 weeks after we got back, Lynn mentioned her mother's kidneys. She'd had a condition for several years, chronic, managed with medication. Not immediately serious, but not something that was going away either. The medication was a monthly cost, the family absorbed, but it wasn't easy. She said this during a conversation about something else entirely. The way you mention things that are always in the background. She wasn't asking for anything, she was just talking. I thought about it for a day. Then I told her I'd like to contribute to the medication costs. Around 3.5 million dong a month, roughly 150 Canadian dollars. It wasn't a large amount, less than my phone bill used to be in Calgary. She said no. I said I wanted to. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, okay. Here's what I told myself. And I remember this framing very clearly because I've had a lot of time since to examine it. I told myself it was the practical version of a gesture. That other men bought their girlfriends flowers or took them to expensive dinners, and those things cost money and evaporated into nothing. This was $150 a month that actually helped someone who needed help. It was, I decided, both thoughtful and rational. The intersection of those two things seemed like a good place to be. I'm aware of how that sounds now. I was not aware at the time. The medication contribution ran for just over a year before everything changed. But I'm getting ahead of things. Around month 11, Lynn told me about a friend with a milk tea shop. The friend's name was Thu. She held a stake in a small shop near one of the university campuses in Da Nang. Good foot traffic, students needing something cold and sweet between classes, the kind of location that works on paper. The problem was management. Du wanted out and needed someone to buy her share. Lynn didn't present this as a request. That's the thing I keep coming back to. She told me about it the way she told me about her mother's medication, as something in her life, not a proposal aimed at me. She said she'd always thought about running something of her own, that this kind of location didn't come along often, that she probably couldn't make it work financially. She looked at her coffee when she said that last part. One asked her what the steak would cost. She said her friend was asking around 200 million dong, about 8,500 Canadian. I asked to see the shop. We went the following Saturday morning. It was on a side street, about a 10-minute walk from a university gate. Small, maybe 6 tables, with a hand-painted sign and a counter that needed work but wasn't beyond it. A kid on a motorbike had pulled up while we were there and bought something to go. I stood outside and counted the student foot traffic for 20 minutes, because that is the kind of person I am. I also talked to a Vietnamese acquaintance from the co-working space, a guy who'd grown up in Da Nang, and described the location. He said the street was decent, that students spent money on food and drink if it was priced right. I went back to Lynn and told her I'd come in as a partner, 40% stake. But I thought the price was high. I offered 168 million dong, $7,200, and said that was my number. There was some back and forth over a few days. In the end, Thu accepted. I handed over the money. The paperwork was a printed agreement that Lynn translated for me. I had a Vietnamese acquaintance look at it who said it seemed fine. Looking back now, nothing in that document would have survived 5 minutes with an actual lawyer. But I didn't know that. I told myself I'd negotiated well. I'd reduced the ask by nearly 15%. I'd done a site visit. I'd consulted a local. I was quite sure, done due diligence. By the end of that month, adding it all up, the motorbike repair, the brothers' enrollment fees, the medication contributions across 8 months, various dinners, and a weekend trip to Hoi An, and now the shop investment, I was somewhere around $13,000 into this relationship in a form or another. I didn't think of it that way at the time. Each thing had its own logic. Each amount had its own justification. It was only later, when I sat down and actually added the column, that I saw what the column said. But that came later. At the time, I just felt, if I'm being precise about it, like someone who had built something worth building. Then the world ended, which is one way to describe early 2020. Vietnam handled COVID early and hard. If you weren't here for it, the short version is that the government moved fast, closed things down fast. And for a period in early 2020, the country was as locked as anywhere in the world. Streets that were normally rivers of motorbikes went quiet. The pho place on my corner put up a handwritten sign and shuttered. The little woman who sold banh mi from a cart outside the co-working space every morning just wasn't there one day, and then wasn't there again. And then the co-working space itself sent a message saying they were closing temporarily, effective immediately. The milk tea shop lasted about 2 weeks after that. Lynn called me one evening and said Thu had decided to close it. The location wasn't viable without the university foot traffic, and with no clear timeline on reopening, Thu wasn't willing to keep paying rent on an empty shopfront. The equipment would go into storage. The stake, my 168 million dong, my $7,200, was effectively gone. Lynn was apologetic in the specific way that people are apologetic about things neither of them caused. Genuine regret, but delivered in a way that made it clear the subject was now closed. I said it was fine. I meant it, mostly. This was a global pandemic. Businesses were closing everywhere. You couldn't argue with that any more than you could argue with the weather. I filed it under circumstances beyond reasonable control, and I moved on. I want to be honest with you about that. I believe that framing completely. I still think it was partially true. I just know now that I was also very motivated to believe it, which is a different thing. Around the same time, the practical question of living arrangements came up. Lynn's rental situation had become complicated. Her flatmate had gone back to her home province, and the shared lease was ending. My serviced apartment was sufficient for one person, but manageable for two. We'd been together for over a year at this point. Moving in seemed like the obvious next step, accelerated by necessity. We found a proper one-bedroom apartment in An Hai Bach, cleaner than my old place, with a small balcony and a kitchen we could actually use. 9 million dong a month, roughly 420 Canadian dollars. I covered it. And then we were just there, together, all the time. This is the part of the story I find hardest to tell, not because it was bad, but because it wasn't. For about 4 months, during Vietnam's strictest restrictions, when you genuinely didn't go out beyond essentials, we built something inside that apartment that I hadn't had before. We cooked. I mean that literally we figured out how to make things from scratch with ingredients from the market down the street, which was still open. Lynn made bunbo hue one afternoon from a recipe she knew from her mother, and the smell of it filled the whole apartment. Lemongrass and shrimp paste and chili. And we ate it at the little table by the balcony door with a fan running because the air conditioning was expensive, and I thought, this is what it's supposed to feel like. We watched television series all the way through. We talked in the evenings the way people talk, when there's nowhere else to be and no reason to perform, not first date conversation, not catching up conversation, just the kind that wanders into actual territory. Her childhood outside Hugh. What she'd wanted to be before the practical realities of her family situation reshaped what was possible. What I'd wanted, if I was being honest, which I was, which was a thing she seemed to draw out of me without trying particularly hard. I'm aware of how this sounds. I'm aware that someone listening to this could say, well, that was the product. That was what she was good at. And maybe that's true. I genuinely don't know. What I know is that it felt complete in a way nothing had before, and that it was the best 4 months I'd had in longer than I could account for. When Vietnam began to ease restrictions through mid and late 2020, life came back gradually. The motorbikes returned. The street food carts reappeared. The co-working space reopened at reduced capacity. Lynn started going out more looking for work, following up on contacts, navigating her own situation. This was reasonable. More than reasonable, it was necessary. She couldn't rely on me for everything, and she wasn't the kind of person who would. I kept paying the rent. I kept the medication contribution going to her mother, which by this point had been running for over a year, at $3.5 million a month. I was working through my savings more steadily than I'd planned. My pension was still 2 years away. When I ran the numbers at the end of 2020, which I did, in a spreadsheet, because of course I did, I'd spent roughly $22,000 across all categories since arriving. That included the shop investment, the loans, the medication, the rent subsidy, and miscellaneous everything else. I looked at that number. I noted it. And then I told myself that for nearly 2 years of living expenses and a relationship in a country with a cost of living as low as Vietnam's, $22,000 was not a catastrophic figure. That I was still well within the overall budget I'd set for myself. That the pension would kick in and stabilize everything. I was very good at this. At looking at a number and explaining it to myself until it sat in a comfortable category. By early 2021, things had shifted further. Not dramatically. Just incrementally, consistently, in one direction. She was out more evenings. When she came home, the conversation was shorter, more functional. What do you want for dinner? I have an early start tomorrow. I noticed it the way you notice the temperature dropping in autumn. Each individual day feels roughly the same as the last, and then one morning you reach for a jacket and realize it's been cold for a while. One evening in February or March, I don't remember exactly, I said something. Something mild. Something like, I feel like we've been a bit disconnected lately. Which is, now that I say it out loud, perhaps the least confrontational way a human being has ever expressed concern about a relationship. Very Canadian, as I would later describe it. She said she'd been stressed, that the job searching was taking a toll, that she was sorry if she'd seemed distant. I said I understood, and here's the thing I've thought about since. I did understand. Her explanation was reasonable. Every single part of it tracked, and I accepted it. I said I understood, and I meant it, and we had a normal evening after that. But I didn't quite believe it. There's a gap between accepting something and believing it. I had not previously understood that gap could exist. I'd always assumed that if an explanation was logically coherent and delivered without obvious deception, accepting it and believing it were the same operation. They're not. And that gap, small, quiet, impossible to act on, was where the next phase of the story began. I just didn't know it yet. I'd been carrying the unease for months before anything actually happened. That's the part one I want you to understand. It wasn't that I was oblivious. It's that I had nothing concrete to act on, and without concrete evidence, I defaulted to giving the benefit of the doubt. That's how I'm wired. Reasonable explanation available? Apply it, move on. But the doubt had its own weight. I felt it every time she came home late with an answer ready, before I'd asked a question. Every time the conversation stayed surface level for an entire evening without either of us acknowledging it. Every time I looked at the apartment we shared and felt more like a lodger than someone who lived there. I ran into Pieter on a Thursday evening in July 2021. He was a Dutch guy I knew from the old co-working space days. Semi-retired, had been in Da Nang about 7 years. We weren't close, But we knew each other the way expats in the same city know each other enough to have a beer, enough to be honest if honesty was required. We ended up at a small bar near the Han River, the kind of place with plastic stools on the footpath, and a fridge full of Lorue, and a television inside showing football. Nobody was watching. After we'd covered the usual ground, how's the project, how's life, all of that, Pierre went quiet for a moment, and then said he had something to tell me, and he wasn't sure he should, but he'd thought about it, and decided he would. He'd seen Lynn more than once, in a part of the city he had no particular reason to be at that time of day, with a man he didn't recognize. Not in a way he could say was definitively anything, but more than once, same man, and something about it had stayed with him enough that he thought I should know. He was careful about it. Chose his words. Made clear he wasn't making accusations. He just thought I should know. I thanked him. We finished our beers. I went home. I didn't say anything to Lynn that night. I sat on the balcony for a while, looking at the street below the last of the evening motorbikes. A woman selling something from a cart. A dog asleep against a wall, and I made a decision. I was going to find out what was actually true. Not confront, not accuse. Find out, gather information, then decide what to do with it. This is what I know how to do. The access point was Zalo. If you haven't lived in Vietnam, Zalo is the messaging app most Vietnamese people use for everything. It's what WhatsApp is in other places, but more so. Lynn had a phone I knew about and used constantly. What I hadn't known, until I started paying closer attention, was that she also had a second handset, older, basic model. She wasn't careful enough about keeping it out of sight, or maybe she'd gotten comfortable. I noticed it a few times over the following week, appearing and disappearing from various places in the apartment. I got into it. I'm not going to explain exactly how, because the method involved an ethical line I crossed, and I'm not proud of it, and I'm not going to describe it in a way that sounds clever. What I'll say is that it took me about 2 weeks. It required patience and one specific moment of opportunity. And once I was in, I wish almost immediately that I wasn't. Not because it was empty, because of what it contained. It wasn't a single thing. It was a pattern. Conversations with multiple men, across multiple cities, extending back years. Not just flirting involvement. A man in Hanoi who'd given her money for what she described to him as a restaurant venture. A man in Hoi An who, based on the messages I read, believed he was in a committed relationship with her. Varying degrees of overlap with my own timeline, my own 2.5 years. I looked at these things for a long time, methodically, like I was diagnosing a system fault and needed to understand the full scope before I did anything about it. Then I found the notes folder. She had a folder in her phone notes. It was labeled in Vietnamese, and I had to look up 2 of the words. It was a financial record, multiple entries, different names, different amounts, different dates. And there, near the middle of the list, was an entry in English, IOU 14 million VND to Lorne, with the date, her name. I sat looking at it for a long time. I had a photograph of that note on my own phone. I had taken it 2.5 years earlier as evidence of her integrity, evidence of the kind of person she was. I had shown it to nobody and referred to it internally countless times as a reason to trust what I was doing. It was entry number 6 in a folder that had 9 entries. I closed the phone and put it back where I'd found it, and sat in the apartment in the afternoon heat with the fan going and the sound of a motorbike somewhere on the street below. And I felt something that I don't have a great word for. Not rage, not exactly grief. More like the specific feeling of understanding something completely for the first time, and wishing the understanding had a different shape. I waited until evening. Lynn came home and made tea, and I told her I needed to talk about something, and I did it the way I do most things, which is calmly and with specific information and without raising my voice. I told her what I knew, not everything. I didn't show her the phone, just enough. Peter, the man he'd seen, the Zalo account, the pattern. She didn't shout. She didn't tell me I was wrong or that I'd misunderstood something. She cried. And then she talked for a while about things I could follow intellectually and could not move through emotionally. Pressure. Family. The gap between what was possible and what was needed. Circumstances that left certain options less available than I might understand. I'm not going to say she was lying in that conversation. I think some of it was true. I think people are complicated, and that the accounting of their choices is rarely as clean as the person on the outside wants it to be. But I was also out $27,500 and 2.5 years, and the specific story I'd told myself about being different. When she finished talking, I said, "I'm going to move out." I said it quietly. She didn't argue. I was out of the apartment within the week. The financial tally, which I did in a spreadsheet because there was no other way I was going to do it, came to this. Direct transfers and loans across the whole period. Approximately 26 million dong, call it $11,400. The rent I'd effectively been carrying alone for 18 months of a tenancy that benefited both of us, roughly 13.5 million dong, about $5,800. The shop investment, 168 million dong, $7,200. Miscellaneous meals, travel, gifts, and 2 months of medication payments I kept sending after I'd left because canceling them felt cruel, and it took me that long to stop, about 7 million dong, around $3,100. Total, approximately 63 million dong, 27,500 Canadian dollars, give or take. I know men who've lost 10 times that. I've read their stories on this channel. I'm aware the number is not catastrophic in the scheme of what's possible here. I know that doesn't help. What I lost that's harder to put in a spreadsheet was the particular self-image of a man who'd done the research, who'd read the stories, who knew the patterns and would recognize them. I'd had a document titled Red Flags and Risk Factors. I had studied this. I was quite certain, the kind of person this didn't happen to. It's a very specific thing to lose. The version of yourself you were most confident about. I moved into a guest house near my old neighborhood and sat with that for a while. I spent 6 weeks in Da Nang after I moved out. I want to be precise about that, because people assume you either leave immediately or you fall apart and stay forever. And I did neither. I found a guest house in An Haibok, not far from where I'd first lived when I arrived, which felt either meaningful or just practical, depending on what mood I was in when I thought about it. I kept my routine. Morning coffee, walk, work on the project that had been sitting mostly idle for a year. I ate comtam for lunch most days at a place 2 streets over where the owner knew my order and didn't require conversation from me, which I appreciated. I was processing. That's the word I kept using in my head. Processing. The question of going back to Canada came up early and got ruled out quickly. My pension was still nearly 2 years away. My condo in Calgary was tenanted on a lease I didn't want to break. And more honestly than either of those things, I didn't want to go home having failed in the way I could already hear being described by people I knew. Not that anyone would say anything directly. That's not how it works. It's quieter than that. It's the careful questions, the slightly too long pauses, the way people look at you when they think you're not watching. I'd rather be in Vietnam processing things at a guest house in An Haibok than in Calgary being processed by everyone who'd watched me leave. So I stayed. And after about 6 weeks, I made a decision, which is what I do when I have enough information. I would recalibrate. I would not let this be the whole story. I'd been to Hoi An twice during my time in Da Nang. It's about an hour south, smaller, older, quieter in a way that Da Nang isn't. The old town is all yellow walls and tiled roofs and lanterns that come on in the evening, and the Thu Bon River runs alongside it, slow and brown and wide. I'd liked it both times for reasons I couldn't fully articulate. It felt like a place where the pace was set by something other than ambition. I moved there in late 2021. I enrolled in a TEFL certification course, teaching English as a foreign language, partly because it would give me an income stream while I waited for the pension, and partly because having a defined task with a defined endpoint was something my brain needed at that point. The course ran for a month. I passed it without distinction, but I passed it, which was all I was aiming for. I found part-time work at a language school in the new part of town 3 afternoons a week, conversation classes for adult learners. The kind of work that is not complicated and requires you to be present and engaged, which turned out to be exactly what I needed. The pension kicked in when I turned 55, about 18 months after I moved to Hoi An. When I ran the numbers, and of course I ran the numbers, I had a new spreadsheet by then, clean and uncontaminated by the old categories that covered my actual life comfortably. Rent on a decent 1-bedroom near the market, 4 million dong, roughly $175. Food, transport, coffee, the occasional beer, another 3 to 4 million. Everything else. I was fine, more than fine, on paper. The teaching income became optional. I kept doing it because the routine was useful, and because standing in front of a room of Vietnamese adults who are trying very hard to construct a sentence in a language that makes no intuitive sense. Watching that effort, watching the moment when something clicks, turned out to be something I don't mind at all. I made friends slowly, expats and locals both. The kind of friendships that build over shared meals and repeated proximity rather than any particular event. I was more careful than I'd been before, which cost me some warmth in the early stages. I held back in ways that probably read as reserve, and some connections that might have developed didn't because I wasn't ready to let them. I mind that. I accept it. It's the arithmetic of what happened, and you don't get to avoid the arithmetic. I dated a couple of times, both brief, both ended by mutual unspoken agreement that it wasn't going anywhere. I'm not going to claim I've figured that part out. One haven't. But I'm not the man who sat alone in a Tim Hortons on a Sunday morning anymore either. And that's not nothing. Here's what I want to say, and I want to say it carefully because I've had a long time to think about it, and I'd rather be precise than dramatic. The forums didn't lie to me. The YouTube channels didn't lie to me. The information I had when I arrived was accurate. The cost of living data, the visa situation, the neighborhood breakdowns, the cultural context around money and family and relationships, all of it was basically right. I had the correct map. I want to be clear about that because it matters for what comes next. What the map didn't contain was the territory of how it would actually feel to be there. It didn't account for what happens to a 52-year-old man who has spent 2 decades being furniture when someone finally notices him. Not performs noticing him, just actually notices him, even if that noticing was, in retrospect, more complicated than it appeared. It didn't account for what lockdown does to a person when they suddenly find themselves living a life that has the shape of the thing they've been missing. Someone to cook with, someone to sit with in the evenings, the specific texture of not being alone in a room. It didn't account for how far a person will travel inside their own rationalizations when they are warm and seen and afraid that the alternative is going back to not being either of those things. The gap between knowing the place and being inside the place. That gap is where every story on this channel actually happens, not in the moment of the ask or the investment or the confrontation, in the gap, in the distance between the version of yourself who read the warning and the version of yourself who is standing in it. I had the map. I just didn't account for how much it would matter to finally be somewhere. That's the whole thing. I think that's everything I can tell you that's actually useful. I still have my spreadsheets. They're about different things now, and that's where we'll leave Lorne. I want to thank him for the level of honesty in this story, because it would have been much easier to frame himself as someone who got unlucky, to point at Lynn and make the story about her. He mostly didn't do that, and that takes something. What I want you to hear, if you're still watching, is the specific shape of his warning. Because Lorne's story is genuinely harder to protect yourself against than the fast burn version. The man who loses his money in the first 3 months at least loses it fast enough to course correct. Lorne's story moved at the pace of a real relationship. Every stage had a reasonable explanation. Every expense had its own logic. The slow burn doesn't feel like burning while it's happening. It feels like warmth. If you're in the research phase right now, if you've got your spreadsheet open and your forum tabs and you've watched some videos including this one, and you're thinking, yes, but I'm not that guy, I know what to look for. I want you to hear what Lorne actually said. Not the cautionary tale version of it. The precise version. The information was real. The map was accurate. The gap was the problem. The gap is always the problem. If this story is sitting with you, share it with someone who might need it. Everything else is in the description. We'll see you on the next one. This has been Inside Vietnam.